The Prince Off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank, in association with Jindal Steel and Power, airline partner SpiceJet.
We are dealing with a world economy that's in a tailspin of the kind we haven't seen before. Now, if somebody has to make sense of it, I can't find anybody better than Martin Wolf, who has many readers in India, a great wise watcher of world economy, chief economics commentator, columnist at the Financial Times. Martin, thank you very much for finding time for us. It's such a privilege to have you on.
It's a great pleasure.
So Martin, give us your helicopter view or your satellite view of the global economy now.
Quite difficult to do in a short period because it's become quite complex and quite diverse. Broadly speaking, the great shock of COVID-19 has led, partly spontaneously, but to a significant measure because of government deliberate policies, to the cessation of a great deal of economic activity around the world while governments try to get control of the disease. And it's pretty clear now that the second quarter, first and particularly second quarter 2020, will have seen a quite extraordinarily dramatic decline in world output. Probably the biggest, almost certainly the biggest peacetime recession in terms of speed and extent, probably ever, even bigger than the Great Depression. We obviously don't know yet the scale of the decline, but it will have been very large. This started with China, which closed down in large extent in the first quarter, and in the second quarter it was led by pretty well all the developed countries, whose economies contracted in a quarter by about 20 or 30%. I mean, this is just extraordinary. Of course, this has also hit many emerging and developing countries, but apart from China, they are still experiencing a lot of the economic shock for reasons I'll come to. It is clear in the developed countries, particularly in Europe, also in Japan, Australia, New Zealand, that the economic collapse is now past us. That is to say, we have been having a recovery probably since the end of April. So we've had a couple of months of recovery, and we will see positive growth in the third quarter and in the fourth quarter. Nonetheless, for the year as a whole, there's clearly going to be a very significant economic contraction in the developed countries. The IMF recently concluded this would be about 8%, I think, this year. That's perhaps a bit pessimistic, but anyway, something enormous. And the world economy will contract about 5%. Again, considerably worse than they thought a couple of months ago. Now, this crisis, economic crisis, is obviously related to the disease. Quite a number of developed countries have brought the disease pretty well under control, and that's why we're reasonably confident, not the US is the big exception, that there will be now a real recovery in Europe, certainly in Japan, and there's already a recovery in China. Now, if you look at the emerging and developing countries, by and large, the disease came to them later. The lockdowns and reactions came later. The incidence of the disease is rising very rapidly. Lockdowns are, on the whole, sustained lockdowns aren't feasible, but they're also being economically hit. They're being economically hit directly by the governments that have done lockdowns, as in India and, of course, elsewhere, but also indirectly, because initially, at least, there's been a huge collapse in world trade, a huge collapse in commodity prices, huge fall in tourism, a huge fall in remittances, and there was a big financial disruption too, massive capital flight. All that created enormous turmoil for most emerging and developing countries. Some that have been better managed, better cushioned, like India, get through it. In South America, Africa, they're very vulnerable to all these shocks in different ways. Fortunately, getting to the end of this, the developed country central banks have acted very dramatically, incredibly dramatically, much more so than in 2008 and 9. They've stabilized financial markets pretty well. Emerging markets are beginning to be able to borrow again. Stock markets are back up. So that's been managed so far very, very well. There's been massive fiscal support in developed countries, quite a bit of it in emerging and developing countries too, quite a lot of money coming from the IMF and so forth. So the shock has been smaller than we feared 2 or 3 months ago because of these actions. Still, emerging and developing countries are on the whole not yet strongly recovering. And though they, I'm sure, will, there is a lagging effect upon them. I think at the global level, we should be past the worst, but this is a very big recession this year. Next year, I think we'll see recovery, but it will be weak. And I mean, it will continue. We won't have recovered fully at the global level next year, though some countries might have done so. And I fear longer term losses. So that's very, very short, very sharp, massive hit in multiple ways. But it looks now that we might be through the worst of it within a year or so. Final word. Of course, all that depends on the disease. And if there is a massive further waves, which is what happened with the Spanish flu 100 years ago or so, then of course all bets are off and we could be back into serious trouble. But people hope that won't happen.
So if you were looking at this world, the 3 countries which have done the best, 3 major countries, and 3 that have done the worst.
Well, that's difficult to answer. I think that in terms of curbing the disease, bringing it under control, given that it was where it started, one has to admit China's done pretty well. Yes. In their ruthless but efficient way, they brought it under control remarkably. I mean, one has to say that. Then I would have to say of the larger economies, Japan, South Korea, and probably Germany are the ones that stand out in that they've managed the disease pretty effectively. They had a relatively small economic hits and they're recovering very well. In terms of the worst, well, of the larger countries, the hardest hit in terms of death and close to the hardest hit economically is probably the UK. The other countries that were very hard hit economically and by the disease are Italy, Spain, and France, so the large European countries. And the US is sort of in a category of its own in a way, in the sense that it hasn't had an extraordinary death rate. We have to recognize that. It's sort of in the middle of the developed countries, but it's still rising. And it hasn't had an extraordinary economic shock because they didn't close down the economy, but they're now closing down bits. So I would say they haven't been the worst hit, a long way from it, partly because they're so decentralized, such a big country, there's lots of space. But I would say that the US is probably, of the major countries, mismanaged it most completely.
And then there is Brazil and Russia.
Well, I was focusing, except for China, on the high-income countries. China is a sort of sui generis case because it's clearly an emerging country. It's rather poor, but it has many of the attributes clearly of an advanced country. Yes, Brazil and Russia are terrible. I was just looking at the Brazilian data. It looks as though their death rate has a very good chance of being I look at it, death rate per million among the highest in the world, and Russia too has tremendous problems. Among the larger emerging countries, I would say Brazil and Russia stand out. India, interestingly, in terms of death rates, pretty low. Of course, huge population, so quite a lot of people, absolutely. It is rising, but not dramatically. I would say that in terms of coping so far with the disease, and indeed with the economy, India's done okay, not startling. But of course, the economy has been hard hit in India. That's quite clear. But I would say the Indian government has handled this substantially better than the Brazilian or the Russian.
Well, I mean, that's not much of a competition.
No, but in terms of death rates, actually, India is among the lowest. In the world, it's just that it's still going up. So as long as that's, at least the figures I've just been looking at suggest it's still going up. And so you don't really know where it will end up. And obviously, India contains an immense number of people. And if infection really runs through what, of course, you know better than I, is a pretty densely populated country with very large cities, it's very difficult to control.
Absolutely. So I think so far they've done a good job of keeping the graph not too steep. It's not flattened, but it's not going too steep. So the system will collapse. So
I think they've done better than I thought they would a little while ago.
Yeah. So Martin, IMF sees India's economy contracting by 4.5% this year.
Yeah.
So Ramana Nair, who is our head of our business and financial coverage, economic coverage, she says she wants me to ask you, do you think it's an optimistic view or a realistic view or a pessimistic view? 4.5% negative.
The honest truth is, I don't know. I suspect, one of the things that's most important, and I couldn't go into this, is it's amazing how little we know. This is a thing that is unfolding in real time. Our statistics are very delayed. So we don't really know what's happening to the economy. We're only just coming out of the second quarter. And our statistics aren't designed to pick up what's going on here. So we're using a lot of strange things. So I genuinely think we don't know. And that's why we're getting these very large forecast changes. I mean, the IMF has changed its picture dramatically in just a couple of months. So I don't know what will happen. But it should be noted that assuming that you normally expect India to grow at least 5 to 6%, that's pretty pessimistic, right? Let's assume that India was going to grow 5%. There was a very controversial discussion, which you, of course, know very well, about how fast is India going to grow? What are the true growth performance? Before any of this started, there was all this debate started by Arvind Subramanian. But let's assume it was 5.5%. Well, if it's actually going to shrink by 4.5%, that's a 10 percentage point difference. So that's a dramatic decline. It's equivalent in the developed world from going from 2 to -8. So right. It suggests, it might be realistic, but it's saying that in the fund's view, the hit to India's growth will basically be as big as the hit to the major advanced countries. I must say, given that the death rate is relatively modest so far, it's a relatively young country, I find that rather pessimistic. I find that certainly very disappointing. I would have hoped that India could do better than that. Whether it will, I really can't comment. My own view has tended to be, I haven't looked at this in great detail, that India's government has not reacted using the fiscal tools particularly as strongly as I think they should have done. I've discussed with a few Indian audiences that I think they could have gone stronger on the fiscal stimulus than they have. But we can always debate this. But I sense that a 10 percentage point swing from the normal growth is pretty bad and it will matter to Indian people. A lot of people will be hurt.
And you think it's pessimistic? It seems pessimistic to you.
I don't know whether it's pessimistic. All I can say is if it isn't pessimistic, it's very disappointing.
Yeah. So you talked about the things that you think that India could have done on the fiscal side that India hasn't done. So hoping that somebody will listen to you, nobody listens to any of us here, hoping that somebody would listen to you, please tell us what are the things India could have done and should still do on the fiscal side.
Well, I think that if it is true that you're headed for a contraction of this scale, which will of course itself affect the fiscal position, the government and you're opening up the economy again, the government really has to provide a lot of support for demand. Now, the simplest way to support demand, I think, in a country like yours, is to give people money to directly support people. You have systems which I think would allow you to do that on a scale such that even the many people who've lost their livelihoods, lost their jobs, can go out and spend very freely. That way their living standards are maintained and demand is maintained. And I think one should be pretty generous about this. I think that it is also obviously important to manage the debt situation of companies so that lots of them don't collapse. But I think that at least they're trying to do that. But to me, the key thing is sustain demand from the people, sustain the incomes of the people for a good year or so through this difficult period. Therefore, sustaining demand in the economy, sustaining lots of small businesses on which Indians depend, and don't worry about the fiscal deficit. I think India can afford to borrow. It finances it. Unlike most emerging and developing countries, India finances itself overwhelmingly through domestic savings. Domestic savings are quite high. Nobody's going to have private demand in this century for funds, so the government can borrow. If India goes back to normal growth, it can manage the debt interest very easily. The relationship between growth and debt interest is favorable in India. So I would say, don't worry about the deficit. Not this year. Spend. And that way, I think the economic decline will be smaller, business confidence will be stronger, the health of the people will be maintained because they can eat and so forth. And don't worry about, and I expect the central bank de facto, as it is done, to support that. So this is not a time, in my view, for being conservative. And I believe there are risks there, but they're not huge ones. India is in a better state to manage a fiscal shock of this kind than most emerging countries.
Would you put a figure, an upper limit to where India can let its fiscal deficit go?
Well, I would have to discuss that. I see no reason why the debt ratio shouldn't be allowed. I mean, after the economy has recovered, to rise by up to 20 percentage points in a shock of this scale. Of course, after that, fiscal policy has to be tightened as the economy recovers. And one of the difficulties is that fiscal discipline has been rather limited before. That's true, and there would have to be more fiscal spending, fiscal discipline afterwards, and that may be incredible. But I think you could let the debt ratio rise by 20 percentage points in India, given its structure. There are risks associated with that, but I would be prepared to contemplate it to ensure that the economy doesn't weaken as much as the IMF is suggesting it might.
So when you say let it rise by 20%, that means if deficit is 4% now, it can rise to 5%?
No, what I mean is the debt ratio, as I understand, the ratio of public sector debt to GDP in India, as I understand it, is about 70%.
Right.
Right. And I'm saying you can go to 90. This will be regarded as very, very radical, but that's my view. Of course, provided there's a credible plan with a strong government to bring it back down again. I don't think that's impossible in a fast-growing country which is reasonably managed. I'm not saying you need to go to 90. I'm just saying you should be prepared to support demand. That means you can run pretty large deficits for a short period.
Nobody knows you to be a reckless man, Martin. So when you say that, I have to take it seriously that you've thought this through.
I have thought it through. It's not what I even wrote a paper for the commission that N.K. Singh, not the present one, but ran some years ago on fiscal reform. I said one of the important things is India needs room to be able to respond to emergencies. Now, my own view is it would have been better if the debt ratio had been smaller now, but it is what it is. It is what it is. But I think India has characteristics. This is a country where well-managed real GDP should be growing 6 or 7% a year. Nominal GDP should be growing 10 to 12% a year. Long-term debt interest rates are way below the nominal growth rate. It really should be possible to bring debt, and you're borrowing domestically in your own currency. You're not borrowing like the Latin Americans in dollars. You're borrowing in your own currency, which you manage. So I think, and monetary discipline has been reasonable despite problems. So I think you can go there reasonably safely, and in a crisis, that's what governments have to do.
So you are asking for government of India to be bold, which is asking Indian bureaucracy to be bold.
Whatever you could say about your prime minister, he is bold.
He's bold. Yes.
He is bold. The bureaucracy may not be. Now, sometimes I think his boldness has been very unwise. I thought the demonetization was not a sensible policy, and I didn't think the overnight lockdown, just like that, was very sensible either. But he is bold. I think he should say, look, a contraction of our economy by 4 or 5% is horrible. This swing we're talking about, 10 percentage points decline relative to trend, is horrible. We have to minimize the cost. This will mean the livelihoods of tens, hundreds of millions of people. Let's go for it fiscally. I know there's a lot of resistance. I've written about this, but I think that's what they should be daring to do. I suspect some of my friends who might be looking at this, and I have many, as you know, will think that I've gone mad, but that is my view. India is one of the few emerging economies that has the capacity, financial, fiscal, and bureaucratic to manage this in this way. Yes, I agree there are risks, but allowing the economy to shrink this much is, I think, very problematic. Remember, after all, per head terms, it's more than minus 4.5. I mean, the population of India is, after all, still growing.
Absolutely.
And there's a big, we didn't discuss it, but as I read it, there's a huge employment problem in India already, even before this crisis. Now, this must now be much worse. So, almost a generation of young people must be having their prospects blighted. Well, I think that government has to prevent that if it can.
Yes. So you called our Prime Minister bold. He's done a few interesting things lately. For example, the allowing of coal mining on a commercial basis in the private sector, given how strong coal unions are and how politicized the coal issue is. That's bold. At the same time, there is also the invitation to private sector to run a bunch of trains. Again, given how strong the railway unions are, that is bold. Last year, there was a big tax rate cut for corporate sector. Now, what are the 2 or 3 things that he can do now? One, by way of reform, besides the fact that he should raise more money by borrowing more, by way of reform to make India more attractive for global businesses, particularly for those who might want to shift out of China.
Well, that's an interesting question. So I think, so let's say, I think you really asked 2 different questions. I've been reasonably persuaded that the short-term, immediate biggest problem is fixing what's sometimes called the 2 or even more balance sheet problem in your private sector, particularly the overhang of debt, the weakness of the financial sector, the banking sector and the non-bank financial sector, and with this, of course, the weakness of many corporates in terms of over-indebtedness, which has clearly dramatically constrained investment. So I've been completely persuaded by the writings, particularly of Arvind Subramanian, but also others, that this is a very high priority. While steps have been taken in this direction, my sense is they haven't been dramatic enough. And I think cleaning up the balance sheet of the banks, I'm in favor, actually, of course, of privatizing a lot of the banks. I understand this is politically difficult, but at least some of them, because they've not been well run, that's pretty obvious. And cleaning up the balance sheets of the corporations, which, of course, does mean taking on the position of the promoters. Put some of these businesses into new hands. But I think the balance sheet problem has been a really big, immediate problem. Now, you also asked effectively about deeper structural reforms. I mean, if I were asked what is, from my perspective, the biggest failure of India, and is education. I mean, so if you asked why won't people come in and set up businesses in the way they set them up in China, I think part of it is they're concerned about whether they will get a sufficiently large, high qualified, literate, but still manual, we're not talking about IT graduates, manual labor force. Where will they get these people? And I think that reflects a bigger problem. But in terms of taking over from China, this is something I've been interested in. I've been interested in Indian trade policy for, 50 years? God, it is nearly 50 years. My very first book was on India's trade policy. It was published in the early 80s. And India has consistently refused, is my sense, to get involved in the labor-intensive, skill-intensive, export-oriented manufacturing world. In the 70s, it was Korea, and then it became China, and India never really competed. And of course, now businesses are going to Vietnam, and in other areas, though they've actually done rather well in Bangladesh. But you know as well as I do that for that to become feasible, and it's much more difficult now. Technology is shifting against this. A lot of reshoring is going on because labor costs matter less. But what do you need? You need absolutely first-rate infrastructure. And the Chinese have supplied, particularly in Guangdong, absolutely world-class infrastructure. You need world-class internet connections. You need a very hard-working, very well-trained, very disciplined labor force, which will do whatever you want. And you need to be able to organize this seamlessly without any interference from the bureaucracy whatsoever. I mean, the interesting thing about China, it's a very bureaucratic country with a terribly powerful government, but they don't get in the way of this at all. And I think this is a mindset. I hate saying that. And I just don't think this is the mindset of India. I think basically there's almost a de facto consensus. Nobody says it openly. We don't want to be like that. We don't want to be vulnerable to the world like that. We don't want to be open like that. We're rather still, and I think it shows very well with your Prime Minister. Your Prime Minister is really still quite suspicious of trade, of foreigners. He has a quite strong inward-looking focus, and the world knows this. So when you talk to world investors, they say it's a great potential market. 1.5 billion people, or whatever it be. Tremendous potential as a consumer market. Lots of very clever scientists and technologists who can work. But we are not going to run our businesses on the basis of supply chains, part of which are in India. It's just not what India wants to do. And it's too difficult. So we're not going to go there. And I think that is the perception. So foreigners will want to invest in India because it's one of the great rising markets of the world, but not there. That's not going to happen without a very profound change in mindset. And I don't see that to my interest. when the Modi government first came in, I thought, well, will this be a change? And the truth is, not really.
Well, Anirudh Datta, who's from the financial markets, he's one of the dadas. He's quoting one of your colleagues in FT, Gideon Rahman.
Right.
He says Gideon Rahman recently wrote that coronavirus could kill populism. Most people, on the other hand, seem to believe that this is counterintuitive and populism will actually rise. So what is it that Martin Wolf believes? You can always disagree with your colleague.
No. First of all, it was a very interesting column, and I've touched on the issues. I think it is perfectly possible that both outcomes will happen. And it will depend a bit on the country and its circumstances and the sort of leadership it has. I think it is plausible that in America, particularly, which is, after all, has a very large and sophisticated, highly educated population, and still a relatively competitive electoral scene, that Trump has overshot himself. Because it's not just that he's a populist, he's so manifestly incompetent, out of control. And I think for many Americans, it's pretty humiliating and not acceptable. So I think it's quite plausible that in America, in this election, people will say enough and they will go against it. And I think in the same way, the British government, which is somewhat less populist, but in that way, will also be forced back by political culture in Britain to show that it is effective. And to some extent, that has begun to happen. Now, if I look at other countries, it varies a lot by how well they're performing. Some of the populists have actually handled the crisis quite well. I mean, for example, in Europe, Viktor Orban in Hungary has actually handled the crisis. He's been quite disciplined. He said it's a big problem, which I think is also true of Mr. Modi. He's not ignored it. I mean, so he's been, he may have a sort of high hand in the way, he may be rather high-handed, but he hasn't ignored completely science and all the rest of it. So that might also help him to do relatively well. In some countries, we're moving towards a quasi-civil war situation. I mean, that's, I think, where Brazil is. There's something like an open war between the president and the establishment, the whole political establishment. Nobody knows how that plays out because it might cease to be parliamentary. So I think what's happening is this crisis is a crisis for any leader, whatever their ideology. And if they fail to deal with it, then they're going to be in very serious trouble. That will be true of democratic leaders and more populist leaders and authoritarian leaders. And then it will depend on how the political system of their country responds, how open, how competitive it is. So I suspect the answer to your question is Gideon could be right and wrong at the same time.
Well, that's the beauty of having many views, many voices, many columnists.
Yes.
Martin, Ramya Nair again wants to know, question, do you trust the economic data coming out of India?
The answer to that is, for the first time in my life, in the last few years, the answer is, I'm afraid, no.
No.
And this is not because of my expertise. Obviously, I follow quite closely the debates in India. I've read some of the commentary with some care, and it seems to me there are inconsistencies between, particularly in the GDP data, between the sectoral data and the aggregate GDP data that are so glaring and that I have not seen for other countries in the past, that suggest to me that something is wrong. If data are this inconsistent, it looks as though there's something wrong. I don't know what it is. And it is clear that many economists that I respect highly, I won't embarrass them by mentioning their names, though some of them are well known, share this concern. So I would say, and that also relates to our earlier discussion about how India's GDP might grow, because of course I was using the official data. But I would say it is plausible to me that for some years actual growth has been significantly lower than reported growth, as again Arvind Subramanian's work with others has suggested. And so I have become a bit concerned about this. And I think, but what's more important than me is many outsiders have, and this of course affects the credibility of India in the world.
You think it's incompetence? Do you think it's politics? Because, as we say at the print, politics matters.
The answer to that, I really don't know. I don't know, and I've tried very, very hard not to issue sort of to say why something that I don't understand is happening. What I do think is that the concerns are sufficiently credible and sufficiently widely held, though not uniformly, there are exceptions, that I would have thought by now a serious effort would have been made to explain the discrepancies and to reconcile them. And so that doesn't seem to me to have happened. And that suggests to me there might well be some measure of deliberate obfuscation here. Where that comes from, what it's motivated by, whether it's error, politically motivated, I have absolutely no idea. Initially, I thought, well, this looks like a mistake, they'll fix it. But now that looks a little less plausible. So I am concerned that something strange is going on. And there are other figures, which you know very well, where data has not been provided in the way that one would expect. So unemployment, for example. So as I said, historically, for such a huge and complex place, India had relatively credible statistics, vastly more than China, which were consistently not believed. And I think that at the moment, the credibility of India's statistics is somewhat under a cloud.
Which is bad for India's brand and which is bad for India's respect in the marketplace.
That is true, but also, of course, it's bad for policy making, because if you don't know what's going on, it makes it more difficult to do things sensibly. I've always been surprised by people's happiness, if you like, to fiddle figures. We've done it in Britain too. We did it very much in the past. For policymakers, having figures that don't represent the truth, if they're serious at all, is very problematic. It's problematic for business. So I think everybody is adversely affected if it's true. And at the very least, the problem needs to be cleaned up. Either they prove that this is all fine and dandy and this is why, or they make changes. But at the moment, as I said, it's under a cloud, and that's costly.
One big thing that's going on in India right now, Martin, in view of what's happening with China, there is a strong anti-China mood. So there is also that reflects in some bans or discouragement of imports from China, and also a popular view that let me not buy anything made in China. How sustainable it is, and if this continues, can India then substitute through domestic production what it buys from China?
I haven't looked at the entire range of products that you import from China, but China is the world's largest manufacturer. It produces more than any other economy in manufacturing, by far. It has a huge range of manufacturing production, which is generally cheap and high quality. I don't think there's any country in the world that can replace all of that at a competitive cost. The whole of Europe couldn't, and the whole of America couldn't. So obviously India can't. I mean, you could do it if you're prepared to pay a big enough price, but that has costs. That affects producers here and consumers, of course, in your country. So I would have thought displacing the whole of China's supply, well, at the very least, it's a very costly thing to do. And it's pretty clear in the American case, and I followed that pretty closely, that they have been unable to do it, and they will find it unbelievably difficult to do. And of course, their capacity to do so is in some ways much, much greater. Nonetheless, I also think that relations between China and its major trading partners are getting worse. They're getting worse for both economic and political reasons. It applies not just to India, of course, it applies to all the Western countries and Japan. So I suspect countries will be trying to substitute away from Chinese products. And to some extent that will happen, but there will be costs associated, real costs associated with that, and you would have to be prepared to bear them.
The Chinese also know that now there is some kind of an anti-China mood, that they are at odds with many major trading partners and others. Yeah. So do you think the Chinese will respond, or do you think the Chinese have now become so arrogant that they will decide to ride roughshod over this?
This is a very, very deep question. I have thought for a long time, and I've written about this actually, that, in the last 4 or 5 years, that the path on which Xi Jinping has been taking China, domestically and externally, is a profound mistake, a profound strategic mistake. I understand why he did it. I followed China fairly closely. I know what he was responding to. But the combination of ever greater authoritarianism at home with increased assertiveness abroad risks sapping economic dynamism in China, which is important, as well as the expectations of an increasingly prosperous and educated people, and of course, uniting the rest of the world against China. And what Mr. Xi is doing is uniting the rest of the world against China. He has only one significant ally, and that's Russia. It's the only significant ally. Everybody else that matters at all in the world, has any real weight in the world, is either sort of neutral or against. And as I've written many times before, China is a great power, but it's not as great as everybody else put together, or even close to it. So I think this is a huge strategic error. Now, how this will play out, I think depends a great deal. I think under Mr. Trump, the chances of a coherent alliance against China are very small. Under Mr. Biden, it could be very different. I think Mr. Biden will try very hard to reach a common position on this with Europe and America. And I suspect, though I'm not sure, though it's obvious Mr. Modi gets on very well with Mr. Trump, I presume Mr. Modi is pretty pragmatic, and he will try to get on with whoever's president of the United States, because, of course, the United States is the most important potential ally for India against China. That's self-evident. So I assume that Mr. Biden would effectively be relatively capable of producing a reasonable security come economic coalition against China. And that will be very bad for China and very bad for the world. But I think it's now where we're heading. And I assume, for reasons of, my enemy's enemy is my friend, that India will de facto be part of this, because it will have to be. At the same time, very last word, economic relations between all these countries and China are important, and other concerns are also important. So I hope it doesn't lead to a complete breakdown, because that will be very, very bad for the world. It'll be very difficult to handle this.
We know very little about China, but do you think there is, at some level in China, there is some debate, some questioning about where Xi Jinping is taking China, yeah, or do you think this new nationalism will just drive it in wherever he wants to take it?
I think that's a very, very profound question. Now, I think very few of us know anything about what's going on in the highest level of the government. But he has obviously created, there are 2 points. He's created a very, very strong position for himself. He's got rid of pretty well everybody who might conceivably be a rival. So we must assume his position is very, very strong. But you can't rule China all on your own. And he's not Mao Zedong. He doesn't have the same charisma of Mao or even Deng, who were, founders, charismatic leaders. He's a bureaucrat, a very powerful bureaucrat, but it's not the same thing. So, of course, there are people who are thinking to themselves, this is not what we want to happen. Now, whether that will change anything, I suspect will depend on whether Mr. Xi is seen as getting China into a really impossible situation. And so far he hasn't, partly because his opponents have been so weak and inconsistent and ill-considered. But I think that might change. So I'm not forecasting anything, nothing. He might be there forever. But for me in my life, one of the most important moments was the fall of Khrushchev. And to me, as a young man, then, Khrushchev seemed absolutely all-powerful in the early 60s. And then quite suddenly, I think it was 64, he was gone. And the reason was that people in the highest levels of the system decided this man has become dangerous. I'm not saying that's happening with Xi. Quite likely it isn't. But I think one can never assume that regimes like this are as strong as they might seem to be from outside. If things go badly wrong for Mr. Xi, of course he could be vulnerable. Anybody can be vulnerable if things go badly wrong. And nationalism alone won't be enough.
And one of the worst things that could go wrong for him, would be if Trump loses, isn't it? The best thing for him is if Trump wins.
Yes. I believe Trump is a great help for both Mr. Xi and Mr. Putin, because he splits the West, because he destroys the fundamental unique selling point of the West, which for all its faults represents ideals that many people around the world aspire to. Most people around the world, certainly educated people, would prefer to live in a democracy with free speech to living under the communist regime. I mean, certainly true in India, isn't it? So I think he is destroying that value too. And though, of course, as I said, somebody like Mr. Modi might find Mr. Trump an attractive partner, I think for most Indians, as I read it, at least most educated Indians interested in international relations, interested in international business, all the rest of it, they're natural partners of the West, not China. And they will want American leadership again, at least in this respect. Understood, of course, that India will never be, just another ally. That's obvious. But I think that a leadership which looks more considered and more careful which could be a Republican, but not Trump.
So I have a couple of questions from our guests. There's Ayush Patodia. These are people from Bombay, so they know finance, and these are things I don't know, so I'll read this question, but I know that it's an important question. So he says, thoughts on the dollar. What are your thoughts on the dollar short squeeze, which is going to take place across the world, as all the countries which have loaded up on the dollar debt post-global financial crisis start defaulting on
it? Well, I suspect that I don't know when this is going to happen. I think that the Fed will continue its current policies long enough for these new debts to survive for quite a while. So I don't expect significant turmoil in the near term. At some point, the Fed is going to change its monetary policy significantly. And at that point, I would guess we're going to begin to see another return of currency to money to the US. And that will probably tend to mean a rise in the dollar. I would expect that to mean, and there will be quite a bit of bad debt. My general view is none of this. I mean, if you're a trader in the market, this is an important stuff. Of course, it can create a lot of turbulence in the market, as we saw just a few months ago. But in terms of the long-term impact on U.S. policy or the dollar as the world currency and so forth, I think the effect will be trivial. It will just create a lot of turbulence. A lot of monetary turbulence is, I think, more or less guaranteed, given where we are. And it's why for 20 years I've been arguing that no sensible developing country would borrow heavily in a foreign currency. It's just too risky.
So that shoots the idea of the sovereign bonds that government of India keeps toying with occasionally.
Yeah, I think you should borrow in rupees. And if foreigners buy them, that can create some problems. But I think large-scale equity inflows are a good thing. Portfolio and FDI, very desirable, though you're not always so encouraging of inward FDI, as you know. Getting in foreign management and foreign business is very good for India. Borrowing a lot in a currency you don't control is very risky. Now, historically, the Indian balance of payments has been reasonably sound, which makes this a bit safer. But the history of Latin America is a history of foreign currency debt problems. And India has the great advantage. Its domestic savings rate overall has been much higher than in Latin America. You don't need foreign savings as such if you manage yourself well, and particularly if the fiscal side is managed well in the long run. So my view is, to cut a long story short, don't borrow in foreign currency. You don't need to.
So, okay, don't borrow in foreign currency. So, Dr. Wolf, what is your advice to India, patient India, on trade policy?
Well, that's a very difficult question now. I think that, coming back to our earlier discussion, there's going to be a lot of trade friction between the West and China. Right. And there's no doubt about that. And that will create problems for you, but also opportunities. Whether you can exploit those opportunities we've discussed earlier, I think you have to change a lot to exploit them. But put that to one side. Apart from the China problem, I think that broadly speaking, the trade system as a whole will remain reasonably open. In fact, the Cold War with China might strengthen that. And if that is correct, then there are still very, very large opportunities for India in trade. Furthermore, I think it is impossible for India in the long run to grow at the rates you want to grow, let's say 7 or 8%, which I think is what you should be growing at, without exports growing at least as fast. You can't have exports shrinking as a share of GDP while GDP is growing at 7 or 8%. So I think exports need to grow 7, 8, 10% a year in real terms. And that is about at least twice as fast and possibly 3 times as fast as world trade. Now, this is a really big challenge.
Right.
So that for India to grow that fast, its exports have to grow much faster than world trade. This will only happen if you make yourselves really competitive. And that means open, allowing imports in, making it easy to export, building up export capacity, integrating into the world economy. That is very somewhat foreign to Indians' view. One of the consensus in India most of the time is trade is sort of dangerous. But I think that is what this means. And while the economy is really doing well in the 2000s, early part, trade was exploding. After the great liberalization in 91, trade exploded. And then it started to stagnate. I think the last 7 years, trade has hardly grown. I don't think that's compatible with fast growth for India. You cannot grow as fast as you want to without trade growing at least as fast and not faster, and much faster than the world economy. So you've got to take a bet on trade. There's no serious alternative. You can't be a self-sufficient economy and grow really fast. No economy in the world in the last 80 years has grown fast as a self-sufficient economy, which is why you change your policies. In fact, I don't think anyone has ever, even in the 19th century, there were special reasons for the US. So you have to go for trade. That means you have to be a big player in trade negotiations. You need to push opening, and you need to be dynamic in the way you develop and create your opportunities. So forward-looking, outward-looking, open. That's the sort of India I've wanted to see for since I wrote my book 40 years ago. Sometimes it's been there, but there's always been too much hesitation, and I think that's why other countries have tended to seize the opportunities, particularly in East Asia, that India should have taken. And I still believe that. So go for trade.
India has to shed its diffidence on trade.
That is my view. If you want to become a developed country, which you clearly do, even though you're a big country in terms of population, you're still a relatively modest economy overall. And you need to develop world-class businesses producing world-class products, and that can't be done Sorry, I lost you.
Yeah, we lost you.
Sorry. So, as I said, India has to be determined if it's to succeed. There are many other things, but if you want to succeed economically, you have to say, we're not only part of the world economy, we're a leading part of the world economy, and we're going to shape the world economy to be what we like. And I think you can do it, and I think you should do it.
Our last question is from our managing editor, YP Rajesh, and this cuts really close to the bone for us. Very parochial. He says, how long do you expect traditional newspapers to be around?
Well, if you mean by that, how long do you think people will still read newsprint? Okay. Well, India, they will probably go on reading newsprint longer than most places. But so let's look at us. We're a traditional newsprint organization. The single, far and away, the bulk of our copy is read every day on one of these. Not a computer, one of these. A mobile phone. Newsprint has value because we can put advertising on it, which is quite valuable, certain sorts of luxury advertising and so forth. And because it's an advertisement, you see people carrying the FT, so that. But in terms of distribution and access to our subscribers, which are a bit special, it's becoming irrelevant. And we are thinking about whether we should continue to print and where we should continue to print. Maybe we used to print, I think, in about 25 places. That's been dramatically reduced. So I am reasonably sure that in Britain and America, over the next, decade or two, newsprint as such will disappear. And it will become online. All sorts of different things will be how this is done. Now, it won't disappear completely. We still read books, despite ebooks. But I think it will largely disappear. Now, I would guess there are countries which are more conservative. Japan still has a huge amount of newsprint consumption. India, perhaps, too. But I think you should plan. The greatest decision our management made, and it was incredibly important for our survival, it's now about 15 years ago, is to focus on building our online subscriptions. And that is the future. I don't know how quickly it will come, but that is the future. If there is a future for what we do, that is the future. And it also means, as is clear here, it's a multimedia future. It's not a print writing future.
Well, it's because we took that lesson to heart that old people like me left print and started something digital, although we still call it the print. And our pretense is that Because people think that once you go digital, you lower the bar. So our pretense is that we have the depth of digital, but the reach. We have the depth of print, but the reach of digital. So let us see. When you come, now you track India through the print, Martin.
I will do so. And I hope print will, I hope the written word will survive, because the written word is beautiful.
Oh, thank you so much. That's a very uplifting note, Martin. You've been very generous with your time and your wisdom. And until we meet again, all the very best to you, and look after yourself.
It's been an enormous pleasure, and I've been very inspiring, the questions you've asked me, and it's forced me to think about things which I hadn't been thinking about for quite a long time, particularly the future of India. And I wish your country, of which I'm enormously fond, very well.
Thank you very much, Martin, a friend of India always. And thank you very much, all of our guests who are watching. Sorry, unlike our usual off the cuff, we can't host you and offer you a drink and something to eat, but we'll make up for it, because this will end one day. So thank you all, and thank you, Martin. Stay safe.
Great pleasure. Great pleasure.